Good afternoon, everyone. So happy that you have joined us. Thank you so very much. I am Teresa Córdova, Director of the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Before I turn it over to Eula to begin today's program, we would like to acknowledge and honor the original people and caretakers of the land now called Houston, including the Atakapa Ishak and the people collectively known as the Coahuiltecans. Through our commitment to care and justice, we honor their elders, past and present, as well as future generations. Eula?
Thank you so much, Teresa. Thank you so much, Teresa. Welcome, and we thank everyone for joining us for this critical discussion hosted by the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues here at UC Berkeley, the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at UC Berkeley, the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois, Chicago. My name is Eula Taylor, and I am the proud department chair of the Department of African American Studies here at UC Berkeley. Before we begin, we want to recognize our co-sponsors for this event: African American Mayors Association, National Urban League, California Association of Black Lawyers, Charles Houston Bar Association, Litigation Division of the California Bar Association, Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, Equal Justice Society, City Club of Chicago, Executives Club of Chicago, the Chicago Community Trust, Metropolitan Family Services of Chicago, Communities Partnering for Peace, Institute for Nonviolence Chicago, Strides for Peace, and WBGO Radio in Newark. Today's event is being recorded live, and all of our guests will be muted for the duration of this program. We invite our audience members to submit questions using the Zoom Q&A feature throughout our program. We want to welcome and thank all of our incredible speakers today: Natasha Korecki, White House Correspondent for Politico, and panelist, Dr. Kathleen Yang-Clayton, a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Public Administration, Dr. Gail Christopher, an award-winning change agent, widely recognized for designing holistic strategies for societal change, Dr. Pedro Noguera, the Emery Stoops and George King Stoops Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education, and our very special guest, City of Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the mayor. Elected in December 2015 and overwhelmingly re-elected in December 2019, Mayor Turner is serving his second four-year term. He is Houston's 62nd mayor. Since taking office, Mayor Turner has expertly managed challenges facing the nation's fourth largest city, including budget deficits, homelessness, and natural disasters, such as Hurricane Harvey. Operating within the city's fiscal constraints, Mayor Turner has passed 5 balanced budgets and championed historic pension reform. He's also launched Houston's first climate action plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with the goal to meet the Paris Agreement carbon neutrality by 2050 and lead the global energy transition. Mayor Turner's signature priorities include complete communities, an initiative designed to revitalize and improve Houston's most underserved neighborhoods by partnering with local stakeholders to leverage resources to create more equitable and prosperous city for all the people of Houston. I will now turn it over to Mayor Turner.
Thank you, Eula, and thank you all for having me today. I think I am the third mayor in this series, and I know you've heard from Mayor Baraka and Mayor Lord Lightfoot from Chicago, and I'm honored to be a part of this discussion today. And look, I just in line with what the opening last year, we changed Columbus Day in the city of Houston to Indigenous People Day, in recognition of those who were here long before Columbus arrived anywhere. So let me, the focus for my remarks today will be on diversity and inclusion, and which is very, very timely and important. Houston is the most diverse region in America. And I would tell you that more than 145 different languages are spoken in the city of Houston. 1 of 4 Houstonian is foreign born. It is totally different from the city where I was born and reared. Totally different from 25 years ago, quite frankly, 15 years ago. It is a totally different place, highly diverse. But what I've also discovered, and even before being mayor, is that you can be highly diverse and yet separate, segregated, and apart. So diversity is descriptive, but you have to choose to be inclusive. So I wanted to focus on diversity and inclusion. 62% of our 2.3 million residents identify as a racial minority in this city. We are also home to the second largest veteran population, I think second to the LA region. And we boast of having the largest LGBTQ community in the state of Texas. We take great pride in our diversity and have been intentional in building on the city's tradition of creating policies and initiatives that make Houston a more inclusive city for all people. We have been working on policies to make Houston a more welcoming city for our diverse immigrant population. And what I have said to the many people in our city, regardless of where you come from, regardless of the language you speak, regardless of your religious, faith-based affiliation, I am your mayor. If you're in the city of Houston, if you're living in the city of Houston, I am your mayor. And I'm pleased to say that we have received 2 distinctions in the areas of government leadership and community from the New American Economy, a bipartisan research organization that advocates sound immigration policies to help grow our economy and create jobs for all Americans. The city of Houston is committed to furthering diversity and inclusion through policies and programming. This commitment is reflective in where we choose to invest our limited resources. There are several departments that I have charged to advance this commitment, because you can say it all day long. The question is, how are you executing those beliefs? One such department, for example, is our Office of Business Opportunity, which was created to intentionally prioritize diversity and inclusion in Houston's local economy, which is important for job creation and success of the city's communities. We measure our impact through the successful administration of the city's minority and women-owned business enterprise, persons with disabilities business enterprise, and the federal disadvantaged business enterprise certification programs, all of which have increased supplier diversity in Houston's public and private sectors. Recently, in partnership with the national and local LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce, we expanded our diversity and inclusion efforts to add a new certification, the LGBT Business Enterprise. In fiscal year 2020, the city of Houston awarded more than $740 million to certified firms, representing almost a quarter of eligible city spend that year. This meaningful participation of MWBEs in the city's procurement process reflects the continued cultivation of a diverse and competitive economic environment in Houston, as well as increased opportunities for business owners and entrepreneurs from all walks of life. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, the city doubled down on our commitment to diversify by crafting a small business economic relief program targeted to meet the needs of historically disenfranchised businesses who have consistently experienced challenges accessing traditional capital. These businesses also operate in neighborhoods that have been historically under-resourced And it is no surprise that these communities have been the hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. I grew up in this city. I grew up in one of these underserved, under-resourced communities. In fact, I will tell you, I still live in the same community, in the same neighborhood in which I was born and reared. It was my mom, a maid, who reared 9 kids literally by herself. And she took pride in that community, in that neighborhood. And I have chosen to stay right there in that community and neighborhood. But in order to make sure that people are given the opportunity to succeed, it is important for us to be very intentional and directional in investing resources in these communities so that these communities, these neighborhoods can be neighborhoods of hope and inspiration and promise. And if we do that, we will put everyone in a better position to become participants in the economic success that we are building in our city. Through our small business economic programs, during COVID-19, for example, we were able to award over 1,000 businesses, small businesses, grants somewhere around $30,000 to $40,000, with 69% of these grant recipients identified as Black, African American, Asian, or Latino. I also continue to push forth initiatives in workforce development in efforts to help to eliminate the barriers to employment Houstonians face through our Turnaround Houston Readiness Fairs. And this is focused on people, for example, who are hard to employ, may not have the skills, may not know how to interview, but to give them an opportunity to take advantage of the job opportunities that we are creating in this city. For the past 5 years, including a virtual one fair this past October, we have hosted this community-based initiative to improve the lives of Houstonians by addressing job training, education, and employment needs. And our virtual fairs are attended by job seekers from a multitude of cultures and ethnicities. To have a long-term impact, an organization should begin boosting diversity by first investing in its leaders. For example, in October of last year, the city of Houston provided training in diversity, equity, and inclusion to our key leaders, such as department directors, managers, supervisors, and all members of my executive and senior management team. But it also is important as to who's sitting in these seats. As you can readily see, I'm an African American. I'm the second African American mayor in the 184 history of this city. And hopefully I will not be the last. My chief of staff is an African American female. My finance director is an Asian female. My city attorney is a Hispanic male. The person head of Metro is a white male. My chief economic development officer is a white male. My police chief and my fire chief happen to be Hispanic. The person who heads one of the largest public works division in the United States, over 4,000 employees, happen to be, in the first time in the history of this city, a white female. So it is important who's sitting in these seats because they will help to direct the policy. But it's not, you can't just stop with who's the director. You have to look and see who's in the mid-management positions as well. And then they have to understand the importance of diversity and inclusion. And so that training is very intentional. And then lastly, before I stop, I will say, and there's a great deal of emphasis on building communities, what we have described as complete communities, to make sure that we are not just stopping with city government, but we are also intentional in putting forth policies, strategies, initiatives that would help build communities. You know, I come out of a family of 9. And when my dad died of cancer when I was 13, but before my dad died, he wanted to make sure that all of his kids were in the house when my mama got ready for dinner. But the kitchen table could only seat 5 at a time. But my daddy wanted all 9 of his kids in the house for dinner. And he wanted us to sit around the kitchen table. So he would say, your mom's got the food ready, the food is on the table. 5 of you go to the table and you can eat. And we 5 of us would go to the table. And after a reasonable period of time, my dad would step into the kitchen and he would tap us on the shoulder and say, you 5 have been at the table long enough. There's another 5 that's ready to come and sit at the table. So it's time for you 5 to get up so that the other 5 can come to the table. We never rushed to the table. We never got into a fight. And that's because we all knew that we were going to have an opportunity to sit at the table. When you're talking about diversity and inclusion, it works best when everybody knows that at some point in time, they'll have an opportunity to sit at the table. And to me, that is what diversity and inclusion is all about. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Mayor, for your leadership and sharing your vision with us today. We are moving on to the conversation with our excellent panelists. Today's panel is moderated by Natasha Korecki, White House correspondent for Politico. Ms. Korecki previously worked as chief political writer at the Chicago Sun-Times, where she wrote a Sunday column. Before that, she covered federal courts and law enforcement during a golden age of political corruption prosecutions in Chicago. Korecki reported on the criminal trials of 2 consecutive governors, George Ryan and Rod Blagojevich, and created the Blago blog, which drew a national following. She is the author of Only in Chicago, based on the Blagojevich probe and trials. Now I will hand it off to Natasha, who will take it from here and no doubt correctly pronounce the name. Thank you, Natasha.
Blagojevich, right. May we forget that name soon. Thank you so much, Eula and Mayor Turner. And again, I want to thank our hosts, the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues and the Department of African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois at Chicago for convening us for this important conversation, and to everyone for being here today. First, let me introduce today's panelists. We have a wonderful group. Dr. Pedro Noguera, the Emery Stoops and Joyce King Stoops Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education. Noguera is a sociologist whose research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by demographic trends in local, regional, and global contexts. He is the author, co-author, and editor of 15 books and hundreds of research articles. We also have Dr. Gail Christopher, who is an award-winning change agent widely recognized for designing holistic strategies and for social change. She is the executive director of the National Collaborative for Health Equity and former senior advisor and vice president of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. She also previously served as the executive director of the Institute for Government Innovation at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Finally, we have Dr. Kathleen Yang-Clayton, who serves as faculty in the Department of Public Administration, College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Prior to joining UIC, she led voting rights and voter mobilization work for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Chicago, where she has helped pass landmark legislation expanding voting rights and strengthening election systems in Illinois. So I will be asking our panelists questions with Mayor Turner for about 30 minutes. And for the last 25 minutes, we will continue the conversation with our remaining panelists. Again, we want this to be a free-flowing conversation. I invite our panelists, please jump in and make points as you see fit. Our audience members are also, as we've said, invited to submit questions throughout the program using the Zoom Q&A feature. So let's get started. I think we are going to turn here right away, Mayor. Let's start with a question that's specific to what you've had to handle in Houston, and that is the February power outages caused by severe weather. First off, can you talk a little bit about what kind of socioeconomic disparities you saw play out in these days, the most severe days of the crisis? For instance, who was affected most harshly?
Well, let me just start off by saying that this was a statewide system failure of the Texas grid. Not only was power out, but power is so much connected to your water systems, your water and wastewater systems. And so power was out and your water supply was very, very limited. The people who were mostly affected are the people who were pretty much operating at the margins in many of these storms. The same people, for example, that were in fact impacted during Hurricane Harvey in the city of Houston in 2017, people in the marginal communities, low-income communities, people who have limited resources, don't have access to quality health care, people who lost their jobs, for example, during the COVID or were furloughed, they were most impacted by the winter storm outages, because when the power went out, they didn't have the resources or the disposable income to go to a hotel, for example, and seek shelter. They didn't have the generators in their homes that would automatically kick in. They had limited means in terms of transportation to go someplace else to get warm. When the power was restored, for example, and the pipes burst, okay, they were having a hard time to come up with money to go and quickly hire a plumber to fix their homes. So they had to wait until assistance could be provided to them. They lost everything in their refrigerators, for example. Not only losing things in their refrigerators when the pipes burst, many of their belongings, personal as well as household furniture, were significantly damaged. So in many ways, it's the same group of people who have had to face one crisis after another. And so they continue to be pushed further down. Those were the people who were disproportionately impacted. The same in many ways, people who have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19.
So you've been a long agitator for increasing reserve power in the state and now for Houston in particular. But and you recently tweeted about a 2011 bill that you had introduced back then. There's been a lot of talk about this. There has been other, pieces of the legislation moving through the legislature. I'm curious, are you satisfied with how the legislature is handling this right now? What do you think can make a difference for residents?
The answer is no, I'm not satisfied. I served in the legislature for 27 years. And I sat on the committee that oversees our Electric Utility Commission. I sat on it for 23 of those 27 years. In 2011, the state of Texas faced a similar winter storm. And in 2011, I filed what we call House Bill 1986 that would have required the Public Utility Commission to mandate ERCOT that manages our Texas grid to have sufficient reserve power to prevent blackouts. That bill by the leadership was not given a hearing. If that bill had passed, the risk that we experienced last month would have been significantly mitigated. We did not take steps, the state of Texas, over the last 10 years to weatherize the system, to engage in resilient measures, to put us in a better place such that when the storm happened again, we would not have the same sort of impacts. This time they were even worse. And what I would say to you, there's a failure to acknowledge that climate change is real, okay? And so the storms come with greater frequency and greater intensity. My greatest disappointment with the powers that be here in the state of Texas was that what happened last month was foreseeable and preventable. And now the question will be whether or not the state will take some definitive fundamental steps this time to build in redundancy, to have a resilient system, to make sure that we have adequate reserve, and to make sure that it's not just a market-driven system where they are hoping that by allowing power generators to charge from $60 a megawatt to $9,000 a megawatt, which happened here, and then with the hope that if we give them more money, that would incentivize them to take the necessary steps to build in resiliency. It didn't happen over the last 10 years, and we'll have to wait and see what happens this time and who will bear the cost of this multi-billion-dollar disaster.
Where do you see your role in this? I mean, you just said that you've seen the same marginalized portions of society being affected by this outage as they have been in COVID. What can you do? Where do you see your role specifically in your city?
And it's multifaceted. What we are doing now is to make sure that we build redundancy and resiliency right here in the city of Houston. Even after Hurricane Harvey, for example, recognizing that these storms and weather events, extreme weather events, are coming with greater frequency and greater intensity. We put in effect the Resilient Houston Plan in February of last year. With respect to climate change, for example, we put in effect the first action climate plan on Earth Day of last year. The city of Houston, for example, purchases more renewable power as a municipality than any other municipality in the country. And as of July 1st of last year, all of the city facilities are 100% powered by renewables. At the same time, based on what happened a month ago, I've instructed my public works department to make sure that we build in redundancy and resiliency for all of our water and wastewater treatment facilities. And we are also looking at building codes, which will acquire for future construction, that all of the pipes in these homes, for example, and apartment complexes are insulated to try to mitigate the risk of pipes bursting down the road. That's on the municipal level. But this is the 4th largest city in the United States, the largest in the state of Texas. With me having served in the legislature, it's also important that I utilize my influence to effectuate policy in the state legislature and to make sure that our state leaders and the Texas House of Representatives and the Texas Senate don't do things that will restrict and limit the people's right to vote, because ultimately that will help to drive the correct policies in the legislature if people don't are not allowed to restrict people's access to the voting booth.
So you're saying that ultimately the change needs to happen at the voting booth so that there are fewer Republicans in the state legislature to block some of this stuff? Is that what?
Well, let me put it this way. I don't have a problem with you being a Republican as long as you have good policies that have a positive impact on the people that I represent. So you can be whatever. But the reality is that we, as elected officials, we are the employee. We are not the employer. Okay, we work at the pleasure and for the benefit of the people who vote on us every single time we have to run. It is important for elected officials to understand that there is accountability, that if you don't institute policies that will be sensitive to the most vulnerable in our society, then you need to be held accountable and you need to pay a price at the polls. Now, what people are attempting to do, because they don't put in place the right policies that are sensitive to that diversity that exists in our communities, they are trying to restrict people's access to the voting booth and limit people's right to vote. Instead of putting in place the right policies, they are trying to restrict people's right to go to vote in order to bring about that accountability. So I, as the mayor of the city of Houston, I have to do everything locally within the city of Houston to make sure that we are preparing for a very resilient society, that we are building up communities and empowering communities and meeting their needs. But at the same time, I can't just stop at the 640 square miles. I have to make sure that I advocate on behalf of the people in my city at the state capitol and even beyond.
I do want to turn to the panel, get them a little involved here on this very question, and feel free to jump in. I am curious, was there an aspect of this crisis that was particularly striking to you? There was so much coverage of it, particularly with, economic and racial disparities within the state. And I open up to any of you to jump in on that one.
I'll jump in, and I just wanted to first say I've spent a lot of time in Houston, so I know the city. And Mayor, I really appreciate your leadership and your description. But what I also know is that many of the residents of Houston are in communities where they're cut off from really important vital services. I spent a lot of time working with schools in the North Forest area. And the needs there were severe before the pandemic, before the freeze. And I'm just wondering, are you as the mayor and the city thinking differently about how to serve communities that have historically been cut off from vital services?
And the answer is yes. When I came in as mayor in January of 2016, I announced that I did not want to be the mayor of two cities in one, or cities of have and have not. You've referred to that North Forest in the northeast sector of the city of Houston. I grew up in the northwest corner sector in Acres Home, what we call Acres Home, the faux. And I know it's 4-4, but we say faux. And I still live in that very same community. And so what we have put in place is what we call complete communities, in which we're very intentional. We have initially identified 5 communities and neighborhoods that were underserved and under-resourced for decades. I've since added another 5, so it's a total of 10. And what we are doing is that we are taking the city's resources, and then we're also trying to leverage the city's resources with faith-based communities, the financial institutions, builders, a number of other support services and builders, so that we can leverage resources on top of one another to bring about the greatest degree of transformation as soon as possible. And when I say complete communities, the question is, what is it that, regardless of who you are and where you live, what are you looking for? And you're looking for decent housing, affordable housing, or mixed income housing. You want quality grocery stores, because there are too many communities where there's still food deserts. You need economic business job opportunities. You want good infrastructure. You want parks and green space, and not just those with a name on it, but they really don't serve any functional purpose. It's all of those elements that we have put together, and we call this initiative Complete Communities, to drive resources in a very intentional way into these communities. And we stay there for 2 to 3 years. And then we build up the leadership, as well as creating sustainable communities. So it's very intentional. It's a very ambitious plan, but it's one that should have taken place decades ago.
Mayor Turner, this is Gail Christopher. I would like to ask you how you mitigate or compensate for the fact that the state of Texas refuses to expand Medicaid and increase access to healthcare for the most vulnerable. And it's particularly striking now, given the recent legislation that passed for the recovery and relief of COVID. So I'm just wondering, what are you thinking? How are you acting that might leverage this moment to increase access? You mentioned that as a major challenge that this recent disaster and all the disasters present.
The state of Texas has never chosen to opt in to Obamacare, never. And as a result, the state of Texas has lost on average about $300 million almost a month, because it has never entered. And quite frankly, you're not going to have provide healthcare to communities on a widespread basis until that happens. And COVID demonstrates very glaringly what happens when communities, for example, or when there's a pandemic, and when communities are disproportionately impacted, and who pays the price for that. We are continuing to make that case in the legislature. But ultimately, what I would say to you, until there is a change of those sitting at the table, you're not going to see a change in policy. And so literally, the state leadership has been insensitive to the need to expand Medicaid in the state of Texas. It needs to happen. When you look at Houston, is a very profitable, a lot of success in the city of Houston. But at the same time, there are 27 to 29% of the people without adequate health care in the city of Houston. There are too many children, for example, who are without adequate health care. And when you look at the numbers themselves on the coronavirus, almost every single day when I am reporting, I'm reporting on people who have contracted and then people who have died, and a large percentage of people of color. Yeah. And it's because they have not had access to affordable quality health care. We will have to change the people sitting at the table to make sure that we put people in there who are sensitive to these needs. And it will happen.
And I think Kathleen Yang has a question too for you.
Sure. Yeah, actually, I kind of want to turn this to more of the nuts and bolts of something that you mentioned at your comments at the beginning, because I think it's really important for people to understand how your executive leadership and the way that you have transformed city government, that government we've seen is an indispensable pillar of democracy right now. And the way you've increased the performance and moved that diversity and racial equity language away from statements and into the very fabric of how your departments and agencies are operating is absolutely astounding. It's really just, I just wanted to hear a little more when you were talking about, sure, up at the top, you have very diverse department heads and supervisors and everything, but how are you also providing more training and more engagement for your frontline and your mid-range supervisors? Why is that important to you?
Well, because oftentimes the people at the top may get it, Kathleen, but it's the people in that mid-management position that are effectuating those policies.
Yeah.
And if the people that are sitting in those mid-management positions don't get it or not supportive, it's not going to happen as quickly as it should. As the mayor of the city of Houston, it may be my vision. I may understand, I may get it. But if my department directors are not aligned with my vision, it's going to be very difficult, okay? Because I can't do everything. And what I say to my department directors, if you don't place the right people, for example, in these mid-management decisions, okay, then the policies, then there's not going to be alignment, and you're not, there will still be stumbling blocks along the way. So the training is not just for those at the top, but the training has to go all the way down the structure, all the way down, okay? Because that's where things are implemented. And then the people who are out, who are interacting, for example, with people out in the field, if they don't get it, then the information doesn't get back to us, and it stops. So you have to have the right people from the top all the way down. And then you have to constantly checking to see if there are where the roadblocks are, because there will be. And it's not just one and done, it has to be ongoing.
Yeah.
And that's why from when I came in, and let me take my public works department, because that touches every community, everything, the 4,000 employees. In the history of my public works department, 184 years, up until I became mayor, all white males, the director, okay? And then I came in and changed it, and it was an Asian male who was the director, and then followed by him, who is the current director now, Carol Haddock, which is the first female of my public works department. Now, mind you, now when you look at public works, do you know who are the key people who are running those, who are my division heads? They are women. Okay, they are women. And when you go below them, you see even more diversity. Okay, and therefore now the department is even more responsive to the to people in the most diverse city in the United States. But it had to go all the way down. And you're constantly having to try, you can't assume that people understand or people get it, okay? Because this unbiased, what's the word for it?
Unconscious.
Yeah, unconscious bias,
Yeah.
people
Implicit
sometimes
bias.
just don't know until you present it to them. Okay, they just don't know. They good people, but they just don't know. And oftentimes people interact with people that they are most used to. Okay.
Right.
Not to cut you off, but we are so pressed for time, and I want to absolutely make sure we get an audience question in here. And I've looked through them, and there is one that's kind of a recurring one, which is, and this kind of goes back to your point earlier about state versus local. The Governor Abbott repealed a lot of the COVID restrictions recently, including the mask mandate, and you have come out against that. You've said that every time you move forward, the governor does something to move you back. I'm curious, and well, a lot of people are curious right now, what can you do to keep your city safe at a time when, bars are reopening, restaurants are reopening, people are coming back out and they don't have to wear masks? What can you do?
Right. Everything is open in the state of Texas 100%, and he's rolled back the mask requirement. With respect to the city of Houston, all of my city facilities and venues and city-sponsored events, you are still mandated to wear masks. If you come to the municipal courts, if you go to the convention centers, for example, if you come to City Hall, if you're out in the city parks, at Little League games, for example, in the stands, you still must wear masks. Beyond that, we've encouraged the business community, the Greater Houston Partnership, which is like the business community. They have said to their employees, please still require your employees, your customers, patrons, when they come in, to wear a mask. And most of them, I would say, are doing that. And then we've gone on television and radio, encouraging people to still put on their masks and to recognize that you have to protect yourself and your families. So that's what we're doing. We're limited. And we are hoping that people will adhere to it, and we shall see what happens in 2 to 3 weeks.
You've talked about diversity a lot. You've talked about your background and where you've come from and being on the front lines. I was told by a couple of consultants in Texas, I can't let you go without asking this, which is, do you have any interest in running for governor?
Hey, look, let me just... There are priority items that I put in place when I came here as mayor. Having grown up and still living in one of those communities that are underserved and under-resourced, it is important to me that we complete these major priority items. That's important. One thing that I know as mayor, you can get things done in real time. I am the city manager. All 23 of the departments, I appoint the department directors. I set the agenda. And so I'm able to drive things in real time. And I want to get those things completed. If I were to run for mayor, for example, I would have to step away from my office right now. If I say to you, I'm running for mayor,
You mean for governor?
Governor.
Or you mean, yeah.
For governor, I would. Some would say I automatically resign, and that is next year. And quite frankly, I love what I do, and I love the people in this city, and I'm even more committed to people who grew up just like I did. A mom with a maid who never learned how to drive, who helped rear 9 kids, and one of those 9 graduated from Harvard Law School because that maid signed the loan papers that made it possible for me to be with you today. I am committed to them. The future will take care of itself.
Are you ruling it out then?
I'm someone who believes that God will take the lead, and I'll just take my cue from him. I try not to rule anything out, but I do try to stay focused. And so let me stay focused, and the people in the city and the state will make the ultimate decision.
Fair enough.
That was a political response, and intentionally.
I am a reporter, so I go after news, but fair enough. Thank you so much for your time, Mayor. We are going to be continuing this discussion, but we want to thank you for joining us and sharing your vision with us.
Thanks. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Come
you.
visit us in Houston, okay?
Wonderful.
Right on.
Well, we'll turn back now to our panel. There's a lot to unpack there, and it went by so quickly. I know that there were so many more questions that we wanted to get in, but maybe we can jump off a little bit about talking about the the mayor talked a lot about, equitable distribution of resources in these time of crises. And I'm curious for your thoughts from all of you. What can local leaders do right now to make sure, at this time when, we do have a big COVID package that's getting unveiled right now, how can local leaders make sure that this is getting equitably distributed in, in their communities? And who would like to start? Please jump in.
Well, one thing that I didn't get a chance, I mean, I know the mayor was very busy, so you're telling us, okay, stop talking. So, but it is really important to follow up and think about how a local municipality, even as big as Houston, has been able to transform its internal environment. The work that's being done by mid-range supervisors, by frontline staff. I know this is the least sexiest stuff. Like Natasha, you work on like the big issues, and I tend to focus on implementation. And when we talk about racial equity, when we talk about statements, they often just float right at the surface, or, we try to allocate funds, but the way that the funding is going to be implemented and how we actually, I mean, the curious part I had for the mayor was, how was he able to convince whomever he did to actually set aside funding to train government staff, to give them the tools to support them identifying how to dismantle bad policies and to implement inclusive policies? This all has to happen across 23 departments. So you can say COVID relief bill, but the way it actually gets operationalized is absolutely critical. And he seems to have gotten the jump, and his team and his staff and everyone seems to be ready to take this money and to actually make some real deep change. So it's pretty exciting to just hear him talk about it.
Kathleen and Natasha, I agree with you 100%. The elephant in the room that I wish we could dive into more deeply, or could have, is the legacy of racism. And we talk about the state and local tensions and the divides, but let's get real. Those were Confederate flags that they used to storm the Capitol. And so that's the undercurrent of this tension and this division. And I really wondered if the mayor, he spoke so eloquently and beautifully and does such great work around diversity and inclusion, but at the same time, he emphasized those who were affected the worst by all the disasters were those who were marginalized, and those are people of color primarily. So I wondered if he has any specific work other than representational equity and diversity and training, if he has specific efforts going on in the city which are trying to address this legacy of racial hierarchy that is so palpable in the state and in the city. So I just, I didn't get a chance to ask him that explicitly, but I think that's Texas has to deal with that,
Yeah, I would just say, just to echo that, America has to deal with that.
Yes.
But it's obviously so obvious in a place like Texas and Houston. But in many ways, I have more hope in local leadership, and I think than I do in state and sometimes federal, because when you're a local leader, you're closer to what's happening to people. But what I would have liked to have heard the mayor talk about more was how he's working with civic organizations, with churches, to address the needs that the city is not addressing, because you can't, in a state like Texas, where they have really limited the power of local government, then you're going to have to rely much more on grassroots efforts. But people have to be organized, and they have to have resources to address needs in the communities. There are examples of that happening, but it needs to go much further than it has.
It's interesting because Pedro and Kathleen, I think, both of you are making similar points here where, when you're talking about disparities and how do you make things equitable, it's you're talking about like very bottom up, like grassroots efforts and getting it. And I was going to ask this down the line, but why don't we just go into it, which is, the Biden administration is facing that right now with vaccine distribution. So they are dealing with this interesting, just from a, societal standpoint, challenge that there's a skepticism, a stiff skepticism about vaccinations, and it's not concentrated on one end of the ideological spectrum. It's community of colors that that don't believe in the vaccine, don't want to get it. And there is likewise that's been playing out in rural regions and conservative end of the spectrum. And what we're sort of, what I've been hearing, I'm just trying to ask people about this a little bit, like, how do you penetrate this? How do you reach out to these very different populations? And what I keep hearing is that it can't be from Biden, it can't be from a politician necessarily. It has to be more of a grassroots effort. It has to be your local pastor or someone you really trust, that you can go to. And I am curious if this is going to be one of the biggest challenges facing, us, not just the administration, but us. If you can't if there's 30%, if there's truly 30% of the population that does not want to get vaccinated, that's an issue. So I'm curious of your thoughts. Like, is that right? If you were going to reach these different goals, that's the way to do it, to sort of bottom up.
I'll jump in here,
Sure.
Natasha. We have to, first of all, acknowledge that some of the hesitancy on the part of at least the African-American community and communities of color, it has to do with timing. It has to do with wisdom. It has to do with, well, let's see if this is okay, because it happens so fast, right? And so what I think the data shows is that there's less hesitancy as time wears on. More people are being convinced because someone close to them got the vaccine, they're okay. So there is this crescendo process that's happening. I agree 100% that it's the people closest to you. It's the people that you respect. I have a PhD sister who works in healthcare who was hesitant, and I didn't say anything, but then 2 days ago, she called me and she said, well, I got my vaccine, so my vaccination, so I think that we're going to see a shift. A lot of the hesitancy, the data is clear that the highest percentage really is among white male Republicans, or what they would say were Trump voters, still buying into all of the fallacies and fantasies about the risk of this disease. But 100%, it is the local communities. It is the echo chamber, of people that are respected and trusted. And it's also every month that goes by, you see a change because people are seeing, that this might be able to be trusted. Whereas initially folks were like, I don't know, it happened pretty fast. So I would say that.
I would just add to that. I agree with what Gail just said. I actually have an op-ed in the USA Today about the school reopening. And it's the same issue. It's really an issue of trust. Who do you trust? And it's not just about opening or not opening. It's a question of whether or not the people who are trusted by parents are telling them, yeah, it's okay for your kids to come back. It's going to be safe. So a lot of our institutions are not led by people who have won the trust of the constituents they serve. And in Houston and throughout the country, it goes back to the racial issues that Gail spoke to. When you've been misserved, underserved for so long, it is hard to believe that suddenly now you can trust the healthcare system or the educational system, even though clearly we need them both right now to step up. So we don't just need the services, we need a different kind of leadership that is doing outreach to the community and building more trusting relationships.
So I think that, I was going to circle back to something that Gail was hinting at a little, that, not to bring this back to Chicago, but, we had a bit of a bumpy opening ourselves. And the fact is that not acknowledging prior underinvestment and unfair policing in our schools, like the government not acknowledging it, the administrators and leaders just not acknowledging it, harms us still to this day. And so that lack of trust, the other thing I was going to mention is, Natasha, to your point, we just finished the census, and I had the honor of asked to work on the census project for the state of Illinois. And from all the way downstate in Hardin County, which is right at the tip of Illinois, to West Englewood, down on the south side, the number one reason that we kept on hearing why people did not want to fill out the census was a distrust in government.
Mhm.
So whatever the Biden administration is planning on doing with this money, local leaders, city leaders, state leaders, we must rebuild trust in government through through walking the walk, getting our government agencies firing on all 6 cylinders, making investments back in government because we've been starved. The other thing to acknowledge is there is an ideology that has been dominant out there that said government is too large, government is wasteful, government is not useful. And now we're turning around and acknowledging, no, we actually need government so that democracy can flourish, so that community organizations has that infrastructure to find those solutions. And hopefully, I'm hoping that's what's going to happen.
We have a little interest in us talking a little bit more about education. And that is, can someone talk a little more generally about education, K through 12, universities, and how they can confront past and present racism right now in today's society?
Well, I'll let my colleagues speak more, but I am proud that we have, been implementing a truth, racial healing, and transformation effort in this country nationally. One, it's an adaptation for our diversity and our history of embedded racism of the truth and reconciliation process. And about 30 of these are happening on college campuses around America. And it is definitely necessary that America, as you said so beautifully, Kathleen, we have to tell the truth. We have to say that our government has been a vehicle for this sort of persistent, inequity. And then really, I think if we're honest and speak to the people from a place of truth with a full effort, I think we're going to begin to build trust. But until we do that, I don't think trust can happen. So college campuses are doing this all across America right now, truth, racial healing, and transformation centers on campuses. And we want to grow that work a lot.
I would just add that in order for that to have that kind of impact, they have to do the work within the institutions themselves, right? Because, our universities, our school systems reflect the inequities in our society. And so unless we are consciously working to address that, by ensuring access, by ensuring opportunities, by ensuring representation throughout, we find that the universities are really reproducing the inequities, not countering them. So we have to work on both ends if we want to see these institutions as a resource for change.
How do you mean reproducing these inequities?
All the data shows the strongest, the predictor of how well you will do in school is your background. All right, so more often than not, kids who are poor end up poor despite going to school. So instead of being engines of social mobility, they're engines of social inequality. And what we need, if they're going to produce social mobility and opportunity, then we have to build on the assets of the communities and of the cultures that we serve, instead of seeing those communities in a deficit lens. You think about the mayor talked about the rich diversity of Houston in terms of language and culture. Well, that's an opportunity to use education as a resource to uplift that entire community. But if you see those with those different backgrounds through the lens that they are somehow deficient because they are not in line with the American traditional norms, then you miss out on that opportunity, and education continues to fail to serve as the resource. But we have, and I was thinking about the mayor. I was thinking about Ruth Simmons. Some of you may know her. She was the former president of Brown University, also from Houston, child of 11, just an incredible woman. So you have examples like the mayor, like Ruth Simmons, of people who've been able to, because of their families, use education to improve their lives. What we need is educational institutions working in concert with families and communities to do this work together.
And if I could just add, we have to change the debt for diploma system that we have in this country. We are really excluding so many young people from being able to afford an education. And that is just something, that is recent. It hasn't always been that way. We used to have public financing for higher education, much more than we do now. Now young people are graduating burdened with debt, and it's a disincentive to even become educated. So we really have to transform from the inside out our opportunity structures, and local colleges and campuses and local governments can be a partner in that process, and must be, really.
When you were talking about these healing centers and so forth, that, can you talk a little bit about what role are they playing right now? What is the goal with them? And do you think that that is going to help achieve some of what we're talking about?
Well, the goal there is to prepare the next generation to be really ambassadors, to understand the truth of the history of this country, and to be committed to be leaders with, or whatever they are, teachers, educators, doctors, social workers, to prepare them to do that with a racial equity understanding. Our institutions of higher education have, as Pedro said, they have perpetuated the racial hierarchy. That's what they're designed to do, And so you've got these centers growing up on these campuses that are trying to help turn that upside down. Now, they understand that the narratives, the stories have to be different, the curricula have to be different. They have to have the skills for crossing racial lines and building relationships of trust, empathy, self-compassion, compassion extended to others. And then they have to examine the structural dynamics and come up with creative, innovative solutions. But the biggest challenge I face, and I'm jumping here, the algorithms of artificial intelligence now are in place to perpetuate the racial divisions and the racial hierarchy of the last 2 centuries. If we don't create a new group of leaders that can be creative and redesign, this technology and these algorithms, and make them no longer a carrier, if you will, of this idea of racial hierarchy, we're going to just see it just float right into the next century. So we really have work to do. Young people have the energy, and if they get the right information and the right guidance and coaching, I think they can help to transform our future.
Yeah, I think that Gail's point is really important to emphasize that there's a fantastic thinker who is, I think, still at UC Berkeley. His name's John Powell. And he has this concept of racialization. And the way I like to describe it to my students is it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole, when you try to tamp down racism here and it pops up over there, and you could try to hit it down and it pops up in algorithms.
Yes.
And that if we collectively don't start to acknowledge that the institutionalized racism within our universities, within our public health systems, that it actually depresses outcomes for everyone, for everyone. And that when we actually see cities like Houston overperforming, outperforming, providing targeted resources to those who need it the most, in fact, everybody benefits from a higher performing government agency for systems. We kind of lose sight of that. And I think it's really important to keep on emphasizing that this is not an academic exercise. This is about how do you get emergency services to people whose plumbing has frozen and they're starving? How do you get better schools? How do we fix this stuff? We can't deal with it just one issue at a time.
A couple audience questions that really actually piggyback quite well with this discussion, and one from and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this, but Vikram Rao, who asks, diversity and inclusion question, how to build vibrant and strong student community on campus, ? Lately, hate crimes is on the rise on campus. And I think that kind of goes into a lot of what you all were talking about, but specifically about hate crimes, which is interesting. Like, here we are trying to have these inclusion centers. It just kind of shows the sharp divisions in our country right now. But I'm wondering if someone can talk about that a little bit more.
Well, this extreme white nationalist movement in this country made a deliberate intention around 2016 to target recruitment on college campuses. And there's some research that supports that. And so one of the reasons we focused on college campuses in implementing this national effort at Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation was to create a counterweight, a counterbalance to this deliberate attempt to reach out and recruit young people when they're most vulnerable. If you look back at all of our major movements, all the way back to the 60s, it was really the young people that led those movements, that led that call for change and transformation. So we have to understand and tap that resource as we strive for equity. I loved what Kathleen was saying and emphasizing the fact that this is for all of us. This is just not a group of people's struggle. This is about democracy. This is about the future of this country. And so framing it that way so that it is a collective effort and it's not, one group against the other. I think that's the key. And that's what the people are learning on the college campuses. I really recommend the book, The Sum of Us, how racism cost us all and how we can prosper.
Who's the author of that book, Gail?
What'd you say? Yes, I was trying to be subtle. Okay, all right. Full disclosure, my daughter wrote that. But she's done an amazing job of shifting the narrative to where we see overcoming racism as our collective work as a society. And so, we have to understand that there is this movement right now to do just the opposite, but we've got to expand the circles of engagement. I don't like the word inclusion personally, because I think it reflects the hierarchy, which says, it's mine and I get to choose to include you in it. And our Native American brothers and sisters and Indigenous folks remind us more to talk about expanding opportunities, right? That it's a circle, that we're more equal than that. But I'm sure others have ideas about how do we create climates of grace and affirmation of the equal value of all people. That's the work, and that's really work.
I mean, I don't want to I really want to hear Pedro talk a bit more about the education piece, but one just quick thing, like the college campus stuff and the hate crimes, it's absolutely critical, the work that Dr. Christopher is doing. I just want to also just remind everyone that, not a lot of our young people are going to four-year colleges. So we also have to drill down to community colleges. And in fact, in Illinois, civics is now in middle schools. And we got to get, again, deep. We got to start with young people so that they know digital literacy, that they are being taught deliberative democratic practice at an early age. Yep. So that if they make it to, UIC or to Berkeley or wherever, that's great. But if they don't, we still know that they have that training and that modeling for how they're supposed to interact with each other in the world.
There was a follow-up quickly to Dr. Christopher's comment about, this is from Peter Kite, the comment about how artificial intelligence is at risk of perpetuating racial inequality. Could we maybe get an example?
Oh, there's so many examples, but the job application pools, right? Now, if you want to apply for a job, so much of that is done online, right? But the algorithms that are used to determine who's qualified and who isn't is based on stereotypes and based on information that is existing today, which is very racialized, right? And so that's one example. Other examples include how they determine who's creditworthy in our society. I heard a story about they look at whether you go into the gas station or whether you fill your gas up at the pump, right? Without going in, you use your credit card. Well, some women in particular may choose to go inside because they feel safer, but the decision that's being made automatically is that if you don't fill it up outside using your credit card, then you are poorer, you are less creditworthy. And so you get that label. So there's so many subtle ways that our behavior, which at this point is racialized and an opportunity, but it gets into the computer system and it gets into the algorithms as a way to define, us in terms of our behaviors. So there's a lot in the medical system it's happening, but I really want Pedro to weigh in on these education questions, because he's the expert on this panel.
Please do, Pedro.
Well, I mean, I think that Gail's point is so well taken, right? That is that on the one hand, we are, especially during the pandemic, much more dependent on technology, and it's been, for those who've had access, been a lifesaver. But we know that access is not universal. We know that these tools are not, they're created by companies with profit as their motive, and not service of humanity as their motive. And so we have to be careful about how we rely on them, whether it be in education or other sectors. I don't think they're going to diminish in terms of their importance by any means. I think that many people like working from home now, and they're going to want to continue to do that. But we have to ensure that there's equity and access. We have to ensure that the tools are available to all kinds of people. And we have to ensure that we don't become so dependent on these tools that we lose sight of the fact that human beings need contact with other humans, especially children. And this is one of the reasons why reopening schools, making them better, should be such a much greater priority. That is, that we not just focus on the logistics of safety, we also use the disruption as an opportunity to change things, to make schools more equitable, more engaging, and more supportive of children. So, these are really critical issues that we need to be addressing right now, because we're moving fast. There's money now available to do a lot of things, but the vision for what to do with that money is not there.
So I do want to get in this question from someone named Cheyenne Daniels. This was a question for the mayor, but I do think it's interesting, particularly actually in this pandemic era that we're in, and now that there's going to be a lot of money going out to different populations, and there may be, some, sore feelings from certain. I actually recently did a story about this, that there's going to be, perhaps some that are more conservatives who feel, well, wait a minute, who's getting the benefit from this? It's people who don't look like me. And this question sort of talks about that, which is, how do we get to those at the top or non-diverse power holders to recognize the importance of diversity and inclusion efforts? How do we keep those efforts going long-term post-pandemic? So how do you speak to these different populations? And I would just add to that, not just people at the top, but other populations that are obviously, part of society. Who wants to jump on that one?
We really not ever worked at that in this country. We have some, I think that empathy and compassion and civility are as important to democracy as voting, So we acknowledge, even though it's flawed, that everyone should have access to voting and should know how to vote, et cetera. We have to acknowledge that this ability to relinquish the zero-sum mentality and to relinquish the legacy of racism that's grounded in this hierarchy of human value, that ability is a learned ability. And we have to really educate, just as Kathleen was saying about teaching civic engagement and civic responsibility. What we try to do with TRHT is we try to say, people have to develop the capacity and the skill to see ourselves in the face of the other. We have to learn to not be racialized in our worldview. And that takes training, it takes experience, it takes opportunity to engage with people who are different. And that's why the campuses potentially are such fertile places for this, because sometimes people get to interact with others, perceived others, for the first time in their lives, when they go to a college campus. And so we have to work at this and make it a national priority. And that's what we mean by racial healing work. And it's not enough to just say we're going to have equity and we're going to distribute resources and we're going to close gaps. No, we have to change the minds and the hearts of the larger number of people. We're not going to get everybody, but we have to get the majority, because that's what it takes to sustain policy change in a democracy.
Yeah, and it's tough right now. Like Natasha, you probably know this better than me, but there's a piece of legislation on the national level that would actually allocate a lot of money to states to set up and stand up civics programs and to fund that. And they're having a hard time finding enough co-sponsors to get this past the finish line. So, in a moment right now where we're so polarized and there is ideological, I don't know what the word is, just, damage that's being done to something as basic as what Gail is saying, we should all be okay with allocating funding on the national level for people to learn about civics and to have a reliable source of information and engagement. And yet here we are struggling to get to that 50, struggling to get co-sponsors, bipartisan co-sponsors. And I don't know, that's beyond my national scale of whatever, but I mean, this is where we're at, but we should be all 100 senators should be like, of course, but that's not where we're at right now. Same thing with voting rights.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The most troubling thing that the mayor shared today was that the state of Texas has still not bought into the Affordable Care Act, which means, millions of people in the state don't have access to healthcare. This is an outrage, but we have to see it as a part of the ongoing struggle in this country for basic rights. And what I liked about his approach was he kind of took the big picture, and said that he's thinking about everybody. And because I think the way you counter the hatred and the bigotry of the last 4 years is not with more hatred. It's with empathy. It's with speaking about human needs, about how when we lift each other, we all can prosper. So my hope is that as we try to move forward in the current period, that we're going to see more leadership at the local level who are willing to do this work. I want to give a shout out to an old friend who runs a birthing center in Houston, Aful Hassan. She serves families from all over the Houston area who want to have births not controlled by hospitals, but controlled by a midwife. She's an incredible person. And what it represents to me is community empowerment. Mm-hmm. That is that we have the means. We can't just wait on government to solve our problems. Grace Lee Boggs, who died not long ago, an elder, told us, look, don't wait for the government to solve your problems. They're not coming. We've got to step up and do the work ourselves. And we have examples of that in Houston and elsewhere.
Okay, well, I hate to tell you this because this is such a wonderful discussion and there are more questions to answer and so forth, but we have run out of time, very unfortunately. But once again, I want to thank our panelists for joining us today and our audience for their questions and attention. I am now going to pass this program back to Stephen Small, who will close us out with a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Thank you to the panelists. Once again, many thanks to my colleagues at the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, the Departments of African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies, both at the University of California, along with the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Thank you to all of these folks for hosting today's discussion. Thank you to Mayor Sylvester Turner, to moderator Natasha Korecki, and to our panelists, Dr. Kathleen Yang-Clayton, Dr. Gail Christopher, and Dr. Pedro Noguera for a fantastically stimulating, thoughtful, and insightful contribution and discussion. Thank you also to our audience for joining us, and thank you so much for the questions that you submitted, which gave us greater stimulation. This is the final event of this series of panels on Black mayors and leadership in the United States. The Institute for the Study of Societal Issues has been on the front lines of these discussions for the last 45 years, since its establishment by our mentor, advocate, and champion of social justice, Professor Troy Duster. Once again, we salute Professor Duster for being an outstanding scholar, an innovative analyst, a visionary leader, and a champion of social justice. And once again, we acknowledge Professor Duster for establishing an institute that has produced so many PhDs of color, so many academics, policymakers, and leaders who are currently infusing universities, foundations, and community organizations across the country with their analysis, insights, and projects for social justice and social change. And I'm proud to say that 3 graduates of the Institute, Teresa, Córdova, Pedro, Noguera, and myself, are on the panel today. Overall, this series has given everyone here a chance to see and hear the lively and critical discussions that we have on a daily basis at the Institute and in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies. We want to thank the more than 1,000 participants who have joined in as our audience over the past 3 weeks. We want to thank you for what have been engaging and provocative times and questions and discussions around some of the essential policy issues currently facing the nation. And by the way, all 3 panels have been video recorded, and you can go to the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues website for copies of all 3 programs. Thank you, everyone. Be safe.